Okay, we have reached our max of participants, which is 500, and we are streaming live on YouTube. So if you have a friend or a colleague that still wants to join, we are streaming live on YouTube. The link has been dropped in the chat. I will drop it again. All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Omega Kappa Chapter's webinar on nursing leadership and management. My name is Alia Brown, and I am the president of the Omega Kappa Chapter of Sigma Theta Tau International, and I greet you all this evening. No further ado, let's get into it. So, getting promoted from within an organization can be exciting for some and challenging for others. Taking on a leadership role presents unique challenges, and one may find it difficult managing former peers. Now, when you are promoted to leadership and managerial role, one quickly learns that being a nurse leader or manager requires a different set of skills or competencies. So this evening, we all will hear from an expert who will share with us how to successfully transition into nursing leadership and management. Our speaker this evening is no stranger to us and really needs no introduction, but I am tasked with introducing him this evening. Our guest speaker is none other than Dr. Oscar Ocho. Dr. Oscar Ocho started off his career as a nursing assistant trainee at San Fernando General Hospital in 1981. He is also a qualified RN and currently serves as the director and senior lecturer at the University of the West Indies School of Nursing in St. Augustine. He was a public servant for more than 30 years, and he has served in a number of departments within the Ministry of Health, encompassing registered nurse, nursing educator, health education officer, director, and chief nursing officer acting prior to joining the faculty at UWI. His academic qualifications include a bachelor's in nursing education, a master of philosophy in sociology, and a doctorate in public health with emphasis of public health and policy. He is also a Parkett Gates Population Leadership as well as Caribbean Health Leadership Institute Fellow. Dr. Ocho is a member of numerous professional organizations, including Trinidad and Tobago's Registered Nurses Association, as well as a part of the Omega Kappa chapter, Sigma Theta Tau International Honor Society for Nursing. As a nurse educator, Dr. Ocho has been instrumental in collaborating in developing the Diploma in Pediatric Hematology Oncology, the Diploma Health Visiting, as well as the Bachelor's of Science in Midwifery. He has also been instrumental in developing a number of short courses, including vaccination training and critical care nursing, just to name a few. Dr. Ocho has also published a number of referee journals with 27 journal publications, 4 book chapters, and over 50 citations. His research interests are in health systems as well as gender and health. He has served as a motivational speaker to youth in the Caribbean, including his home country, Trinidad and Tobago, and he is the husband of Mrs. Pauline Bregwell Ocho for the last 35 years. I present to you now Dr. Oscar Noel Ocho.
So thank you so very much, Alia. It's a good thing I didn't send you a profile of my good self, but it's a privilege to be on this platform this afternoon. Yesterday, I was on with the Caribbean Nurses Organization, and today I am here as a proud member of the Omega Kappa chapter and really want to commend you for the work you continue to build on. That was established by your predecessor. And I put a title to this presentation. I'm hoping that I'd spend about 40 minutes because this is supposed to be 1 hour in the presentation. And then we'll have time to interface and interact by having some questions answered. So the title I have opted to use is Nurses' Preparation and Competencies for Transitioning into Positions of Leadership, a Caribbean Perspective. And I will root this presentation within the context of a piece of work that we did trying to understand what is required for nurses to transition, as well as what are some of the core competencies that are required. But I'm also going to link that to the literature. So we will shape this presentation by first covering 4 objectives, looking at the context of nursing leadership in the Caribbean, examining findings from a Caribbean-specific research on transitioning into leadership. We'll also examine the challenges associated with nurse leadership in the Caribbean, some of which have been highlighted by our erstwhile president. And then we would end by looking at some frameworks for nursing leadership competencies. I want to start off by providing a context for nursing leadership transitioning. We all will agree that within the context of the Caribbean, we still operate with a very medical model framework, where the doctors are seen as the gods of the health system, nurses, and then the other professions will fall behind. But we also need to consider that while there has been a change in the approach to nursing education, where we have transitioned from the apprenticeship type program, where you practiced in tandem with your training, we now have full student status. And in some instances, students are not able to access the clinical area until their 2nd year of training. And there continues to be a significant level of debate within the context of nurse leaders in the Caribbean as to the implications of that on the quality of the products that we are producing in the profession. But I can't help but recognize that wherever we go in the Caribbean, we continue to hear stories about having more qualified nurses, persons who are at the baccalaureate, at the master's level. We are even having more and more doctorally prepared nurses in the region. But there is not a commensurate level of respect for the nursing manpower. When I entered this profession, 43, almost 43 years ago, because in a few weeks' time, it will be 43 years. Not one of our nursing administrators, we called them matrons at the time, far less supervisors and head nurses, they didn't even know what a university all looked like because they were well trained in the apprenticeship system. And through their expertise and experience, they were able to manage those clinical areas. I remember one of the former directors of PAHO. He gave me a story about how he married his wife. He was a junior doctor working in accident and emergency in Jamaica, and he had to do a localized suture. And here he was with his syringe and needle about to puncture that lidocaine. And as he was about to do that, that young nurse stopped him in his tracks and asked him what was he doing because he had not sterilized the vial. And he said to me, he said, I asked myself, I am the doctor, who is this face in this? And then he said, you know what? She became my wife. Because here it is, a nurse with just RN, maybe I don't know if she had LM at the time, but was able to command a certain level of respect from the doctor within the context of the environment. These people had no degrees, but we are now having persons with degrees, but no temperature. But there is also a challenge that we face because very often there's an incongruence between management expectations and staff commitment. So that as we are looking at Generation Z and Generation X and the postmodern era, a lot of individuals are coming into the profession without the commensurate level of commitment because many of them are just looking for a transshipment point to become eligible for employment internationally. So that level of passion and commitment to serve and to care is very often in conflict with you as a nurse leader who will expect this person to be dutiful and caring when it comes to the delivery of services. We in the Caribbean, we can boast about very respectable nurse leaders in the Caribbean. And on every Caribbean island, from Barbados with Dame Nita Barrow to Jamaica with people like Syringa Marshall Burnett and Mavis Haney and others in Trinidad and Tobago, Berenice Dolly. In Grenada, you look at Miss Claxton. All over the Caribbean, we have had respected nurse leaders who were able to put nursing on the map, even when they were not degreed. And, and part of the challenge we are also facing in our context is that we are having a number of nurse leaders who have, as it were, positional um, functions. And I'm going to use the word authority advisedly. But even in that context, some of them do not have the commensurate level of personal power. And therefore, the concern about global um, leadership, but leadership in nursing continues to be a global issue. And part of this, from the Caribbean perspective, is that we are having such a significant impact on, on our brain drain, where, and as a result, younger nurses are now being tasked to assume higher levels of leadership in the organization, but they may not have the commensurate level of experience from the clinical level. So when it comes to supervision, when it comes to accountability, it's so difficult to make that transition. And that continues to be an expressed concern that in 2015, the PAHO um, held a meeting of general government chief nursing and midwifery officers, where we really were tasked with looking at what are some of the leadership and core competencies that are required of nurse leaders in the region. This was also followed up by the Global Advisory Panel on the Future of Nursing and Midwifery, the GAP Fund report, which came out in 2017, which, arose from Sigma Theta Tau, where we had all the regions globally. There were there were interventions where leaders came together to identify what are some of the core issues and top priority, whether it was the Caribbean, Latin America, the Americas, Africa, Asia, the top priority among all the stakeholders was the challenge with leadership. And that's why I love what the Center for Creative Leadership posits. They posit that not preparing first-time managers weakens the leadership pipeline and may hurt the bottom line of the organization. So coming out of our PAHO workshop, which was held in 2015, with the government chief nursing and midwifery officers, we came out with what we saw as some of the core competencies that are required for success as leaders, as persons transition into positions of leadership. And these included emotional intelligence, political astuteness, networking and collaboration, as well as communication. And we'll revisit that when we look at some of the frameworks. But let's not forget the Caribbean. While we are divided by water, while we may be considered one CARICOM, the Caribbean is extremely complex. And part of the complexity that continues to affect nursing and midwifery in the region has a lot to do with the fact that many of us are coming from small island states. And coming from small island states, there's a greater potential for political interference in how appointments and so on are created. So, in other words, a person can be appointed because they are politically aligned, and it may not have anything to do with their training and experience. You may find that in some instances, governments may go through all kinds of gymnastics just to ensure that their preferred candidate is appointed in the position, but their preferred candidate may not necessarily be the most suitable and competent candidate. As a result of this, there is a tension that can be created where that person, when they are placed in that position of trust, there is an allegiance to the employer, because after all, it is because of the connectedness that will affect how you function. And therefore, it creates some tension sometimes when it comes to your personal values, which continues to create tensions between, are these persons, are they coming to the table with the right sets of competencies? And I will not use the word skills, because skills speak to dexterity, but competencies look at the alignment between the cognitive, the affective, and the psychomotor. And therefore, sometimes the connections may trump the competence. So, what we did um, in this School of Nursing is that we decided to do a piece of research that was Caribbean specific. And we wanted to do it in all the Caribbean countries, but we got ethical approval from 4 countries. And so we wanted to explore the experiences of nurse managers and supervisors during their transition from staff nurse to managers. And we also wanted to identify the current strategies utilized to support their transitioning, as well as identify the gaps and challenges and determine the core competencies for successful leadership. So we came up with a clear research question. What are the experiences of nurse managers, supervisors in transitioning to positions of from RN to positions as managers? And this was supported by 3 sub-questions. We originally had 6 countries included: Antigua and Bermuda, Barbados, Jamaica, St. Lucia, the Bahamas, and Trinidad and Tobago. And because of Dalhousie University, as well as Paro, Grenada, and Belize were included, but we only got ethical approval from 4 countries: Belize, Grenada, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines, and Trinidad and Tobago. Our estimated sample was 301 RNs. We ended up with 201 RNs based on the data that we were able to collect. And we used quantitative data, a questionnaire of 30 close-ended, open-ended, and Likert scale questions, and we analyzed that data using SPSS. Now, if you look at the findings, just looking at the cross-tabulation, most of the persons who would have transitioned had an associate degree. Okay? If you look at the experience, most of them would have had 10 to 15 years experience, whether they were senior head nurse supervisor or administrator. We also recognize that most of the respondents came from Trinidad and Tobago. Therefore, we didn't have a representative sample from the other regions. So country-specific analysis could not have been done for this piece of research. We also saw that most of the persons were between the ages of 35 to 55 years of age. They were employed for between 10 to less than well, 20 years and over. And most of the participants were head nurses, as well as most of them had a BSc degree. Now, in examining the findings, we wanted to look at what were some of the facilitators. And 88 or 70% of the participants said they felt prepared for transitioning into positions of leadership. We also had 63% saying they felt that they were trained. Now, we didn't distinguish between a BSCN as a generic BSCN and a BSCN as a post-RN BSCN. But you would have seen that we would have had persons at the master's and also the doctoral level. They also felt 69% said opportunities for acting in a higher position also help them to be prepared. And 76%, and that's an important number, they felt that having supportive supervisors, because here it is, you are transitioning into this role as a supervisor. And if you do not have the correct kind of coaching mentoring, what are the implications of that? But 67% also highlighted having cooperative and supportive staff. So we decided to see whether there were any relationship between persons who felt prepared and some other core variables. Age was correlated. If you look at the data, people were between the years of 25 to 55. So clearly, while there was a weak correlation, it was statistically significant, P less than 5. Training for the position had the strongest moderate level of correlation, 0.644, and it was also statistically significant. While acting had a weak correlation, it was statistically significant again. But look at the importance of preceptorship and mentorship. While it was weak, statistically significant. Having a role model was also weak, but statistically significant. Having a supportive supervisor and having a mentor or preceptor. We also decided to examine what are some of the core competencies that are required. And if you look at the raw figures, we asked them to rate it on a scale of 1 to 6. And leadership was identified as the major competency. But the reality is, when you look at the literature, Leadership is an overarching competency. So, what are the key competencies that are critical for transitioning ended up after leadership as motivation and team building? But it was important for us to examine from the perspective of the nurses who had transitioned. What did they see as some of the challenges that they had with transitioning into positions of leadership? Availability or unavailability or inadequate levels of resources was a key factor. Because here it is, if you want me to be successful as a leader, how are you going to ensure that I am successful if you don't give me the resources? And very often, nurse leaders within the context of the Caribbean continue to be asked to function at an optimum and to function at a premium. But the resources that will ensure that they are effective are not readily available. Further, 70% spoke about the absence of succession planning. And we'll speak to this contextually as one of the big challenges that face or are experienced by nurses who are transitioning. So you may find yourself being called today to take over a unit as a leader tomorrow without any sense of knowing that you were being groomed to assume those positions. But we also found that promotion was inconsistent with human resource succession planning. So while it was not present, you also had situations where persons were bypassed who were eligible, but they were bypassed because there was a preferred candidate, not necessarily a prepared candidate. And what I found extremely interesting is that 39% of the participants, even though they were promoted to positions of leadership, they said qualifications and not experience should be used as a criteria for promotion. And this is something that we have to consider extremely carefully as we continue to look at leadership within the context of the Caribbean. Because you may have persons who may be perpetual students who are driven and motivated to achieve academic success. But that doesn't mean that they were at the bedside, carrying out the responsibilities, understanding the applications of theory to practice. And because they are better qualified, there is an assumption that certification is the strategy for moving forward. But what we are also seeing is that while we have more certified persons, it does not redound to a more competent individual. And as Professor Hermie Hewitt, my education mentor from Jamaica, she would speak to having degrees, but no temperatures. So when we did some further analysis, looking at the strengths of the relationship, we recognized that there was no relationship between preparation and having a role model, while A correlation showed statistical significance. The Chi-Quest test, which looked at the strength of the relationship, didn't show statistical significance, nor was promotion being consistent with succession planning, having a supportive staff, or having resources. But what we also recognize that when it comes to the core competencies, those, those statistically significant variables were delegation, team building, networking, and emotional intelligence. When we also saw that there were moderate correlations. And if you look at the scores, the 0.5, the 0.6, and the 0.6 and 5, delegation networking, um, we saw moderate correlations between networking and delegation, emotional intelligence, and motivation. But as we shift from the findings from this study, it's important for us to recognize what are some of the big challenges that our nurse leaders and potential leaders face within the context of the Caribbean. And what we find ourselves experiencing very often is replacement planning and not succession planning. You see, with replacement planning, there is no strategic investment because the focus is on getting immediate talent that may result from unexpected emergencies. So somebody may resign, even though someone may be retiring. Sometimes there is so much inertia in positioning the person who should take over that the person is ready to leave. And we find ourselves very often just trying to plug a hole. And you would find that in such a situation, persons or candidates are employed to temporarily fill critical roles until a permanent solution is found. But we have stories that for years, this person is still acting, and sometimes the period of acting is over. There is still no suitable replacement. And even without the piece of paper from HR to allow that extension, that individual is still there in abeyance, expected to execute all the functions of a leader, but there is no positional authority because the suitable replacement is still not yet found. And if we continue with replacement planning, that is supposed to be a quick fix. That is not sustainable. And that is why we have to then call for greater investment in succession planning. Because with succession planning, the focus is on long-term leadership development. So you have to be able, as an organization, and nursing organizations must come face to face with this reality. You have to now look at how do we identify and cultivate individuals with the potential to assume key leadership positions in an organization. What this means then is that you will have to look at a combination of expertise or competence. And it may have and it will have to be a combination of training as well as experience. If you are to cultivate this, then what it means is that you have a core responsibility in ensuring that you invest in the preparation of these individuals who will take over the leadership of the organization. But the challenge that we face is that with replacement planning, there is an assumption that the structure will not change. So I will put you to hold on, but in holding on, you are just to keep the ship or the ward or the institution afloat. And therefore, in considering replacement, you are not concerned about the lower levels of staff. You are just concerned about those persons who will serve at the top level of the organization. But at the other level, if we really focus on succession planning, and as the previous slide would have spoken to investing and harnessing and cultivating persons who would assume positions of leadership. It means that if organizations, our health institutions, whether they are managed by the boards or they are managed centrally by the Ministry of Health, it means that if they are serious about succession planning, and they invest in developing core competencies, the organization will be easily able to fill vacancies because you would have had a system to empower and develop. So it would come like a production line where you have a cadre of persons who at any time could fall into position because you were invested in their preparation. But while this may take a little more time and effort, the long-term benefit is going to be phenomenal. And that's why I love how Wiggins, this is part of his doctoral thesis. And I really love this framework because what Wiggins, in looking at nurse leadership transition, he identified six core, core behaviors or competencies that must be considered as you transition into positions of leadership. And the first he spoke to is the cognitive. So you have to come to this table as a leader, understanding that you cannot bring baggage. While leadership, you will come into the arena of the unknown. You have to come with an understanding that no one is doing you a favor, but you have earned the right. So therefore, you have to learn to let go of baggage. Forget how the past leader was treated, and you change your frame of reference to see how you are going to move from a transactional to a transformative, visionary leader. It takes a cognitive shift and a reorientation of your own understanding and interpretation of leadership, not because somebody failed. It means that you will fail. One of the things that struck me when I was chief nursing officer, and I remember my very first meeting when I went to the regional nursing body meeting. And I came back and I had a discussion with my my permanent secretary. And I said, PS, these were the issues that we discussed at the regional nursing body meeting. And these are the implications that it will have for nursing in Trinidad and Tobago. And I remember my PS, she turned to me and she said, Dr. Ocho, look how you could just talk about these things. She said, I am in this ministry for 1.5 years, and I always thought that nursing was hopeless. That was an eye opener for me. Here was I coming into this organization, not under the best circumstances. But because I came with a frame of reference that I was coming as a change agent, not knowing that my permanent secretary saw nursing as hopeless, one conversation, because of my cognitive frame of reference, changed her perception of nursing in the country. The other he speaks to is the psychological. And he speaks to the importance of us being psychologically aware of ourselves. And if you look at emotional intelligence and you look at Goldman, looking at the four critical areas and the 5 competencies, Goldman starts with self-awareness. So when we are talking about that psychological frame of reference, you are going sometimes into an environment where there'll be sharks and wolves, but there will also be persons who will be willing to be your allies. So you're not going to burn bridges, or you're not going to come over as though in local parlance. We're talking about a bull in a china shop. But you're going understanding that while there are people who will be there to make your life miserable, you are not to allow that to affect your psychological frame of reference, because one action that is inappropriate could affect the whole ethos of the organization. He also speaks of the importance of that interpersonal skill, where as a leader, you will be functioning in an organizational hierarchy. And looking at Weber's theory, you have to recognize that as leadership theory emerge, interpersonal relationships are key to success in an organization. But he also spoke to the behavioral. How do you relate to persons who don't even want to work with you? How do you ensure that there is equity and fairness in how you distribute responsibilities and how you treat people? Because people will be observing your behavior as a leader. And brings me to the fifth area that he spoke to, is that relational. You are going to come from a context where yesterday you were their peer. Today you are now their supervisor. And sometimes that could be very difficult to navigate, because people expect that as you transition, friendship will also transition. But that's a critical issue that has to be addressed. And then he says, you need, as you transition, to understand what is your role and the context of the organization. It brings me to a construct that I was first exposed to at the University of Washington in Seattle by my professor on leadership, because I was a fellow at the University of Washington. And Dr. Doble, Professor Doble, rather, Pat Doble, um, He really exposed us as leaders to the constructs that are critical. You need to recognize what is the context of this organization. There are some organizations that focus on high performance. There are some organizations that focus on the laissez-faire. But whatever the context of the organization is, you need to learn the context of the organization. Because if you are laid back in personality, but the organization is focused on high performance, you realize that you have to come into this organization with a sense of understanding that the context requires movement, motion, and vision. So you cannot afford to be laid back. But he also says that you have to understand your organization culture. In some organization, there's a culture of the grapevine where if you carry enough information to the person in charge, you're going to get by. So you get a blind, you get opportunities, and you have to be very, 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 and extremely careful that you do not create a culture where people feel that they could, like crab in a barrel, they could get on others' backs to get ahead, because the same persons who bring news to you to get ahead, you just might find that they will be able to get ahead of you if they are aligned properly. That's why you have to know those stakeholders. You have to understand the personalities that you are dealing with, because people may want to be aligned to you, not because they like you, but they recognize that if they stay close to you, they will get the favors to position them. But a key construct that he exposed us to is that as a leader, you have to understand your authorizing environment. Where does your authority come from? And if you look at the concept of power from the perspective of leadership, you have to recognize that your authority first will come from the acknowledgement that you didn't put yourself there, but HR authorized you with a document that says that you're a leader. You also have to recognize that if you are functioning in an environment where your immediate supervisor is aligning himself or herself with your junior staff, it puts you in a very compromising position. And within the context of the Caribbean, we continue to have persons who will go above you to try and get ahead. And if you do not have an effective authorizing environment, one of the things I have learned as a leader is that you have to learn to think politically, but strategically, so that you will understand how you align yourselves with the right persons to be effective. And therefore, in looking at some of the best practices for successful leadership, succession planning, there are some 5 key considerations. One is to know what are the key roles and competencies that are required. And organizations need to look at their talent pool, because there may be a person who is junior, but that person is showing signs of leadership. How are you going to harness that? But you also have to use a mix of development methods, whether it's coaching, whether it's mentoring, whether it's allowing persons to be assigned to individuals for a period of time, whether it's rotating persons through different experiences. But you also have to evaluate your leaders in different contexts. How do they deal with conflicts? How do they deal with emergencies? What kind of emotional disposition do they display when they are placed in particular situations? But the organization also has to plan for emergency successions. And therefore, we have to now look at what are some of the competency frameworks. And I love the WHO framework because the WHO framework looks at the responsibility because they are looking here at the government chief nursing and midwifery officers. And what they are arguing is that the chief nursing officer, and that could be down to the nursing administrator or director or PNO or nurse manager. You are to assist the government or your organization to achieve the best result for nursing and midwifery in your context. But they also look at four key roles: leadership and influence, because you have to sit at the table to articulate your point of view in a way that you must be heard. Policy, planning, and delivery of health systems and services, and we'll come to health systems in a bit, as well as understanding what are some of the programs that we need to implement for health status improvement. And what this framework speaks to then is that from the policy level, you need to understand policy development and public policy and political astuteness and research utilization. But you are also expected to come to the table with leadership competence, communication, professionalism, understanding change management, even team leadership. But you will also be expected to provide management. While leadership is key, management, how do you plan? How do you speak to resource allocation as well as development of your human resource? I like Sherman 23, 2013, the Nursing Leadership Institute competency model. And in this model, they identified 6 key things looking at systems thinking. You are not just there to look at nursing, but nursing within the context of the health system. Personal mastery, emotional intelligence. They place financial management, human resource management, interpersonal effectiveness. But look at what they have also identified: caring. But what this model has done, this model has said that apart from these 6 core competencies, there are 2 core competencies that are overarching. And I think it is so important for us to consider this. And they say one is the ability to remain optimistic during times of turbulence. There will be times in your leadership when you would feel as though the day should never end. But there are other times when you'll wonder, what did you get yourself into? You have to learn, like David, how to encourage yourself to ensure that trouble will not always last. But you are coming to the table ready to lead. But they also spoke to the ability to be resilient during times of great change. So that resilience and optimism is overarching when one considers the competency framework. But coming out of the research, which I started with, and we got two publications out of it in very reputable journals. One speaks to readiness for transitioning. That is in the Journal of Nursing Management. And the other spoke to the core competencies. That is in health systems research, I think. And two publications came up, but what was key is that the tension between leadership as an expectation. So here it is. Your colleagues who you are leading, they expect you to provide leadership. In that, they expect that when you go at the board level, when you go at the policy level, you represent their concerns and their interests. And they don't recognize that you are like one little fish in a shark tank. But they expect that leadership. But your supervisors, they expect leadership as a role. You go there and ensure that the policies are implemented. Now, you could see how that could create a certain level of tension because you want to get a good appraisal from your bosses, but your people are also appraising you. So, how do we ensure that their expectation and your role is a match? I submit then that there are some core skills that each of us need, which would have been included in my presentation so far. Emotional intelligence. And we can't stress that enough. Research, where you must now not only know how to utilize research, but even as you look at your wards, you look at your data on your wards, how can you use the data to come up with an interpretation that will cause your leaders to whom you report to take note that you are able to observe trends, and in looking at trends, recommendations could be made. You need to know how to utilize that evidence to help inform policy. So, because you have to understand the policy development process, but you need communication, both oral and written. When you speak, people must want to hear. But you also have to recognize that you can't do this alone. So how do you build collaborations, networks, that systems thinking? You are a nurse at the board level, but you are part of a system. So how do you ensure that when you sit there, you are not just thinking about nursing, but you have to think about how nursing fits into the big picture? But you have to recognize that information keeps changing. So how are you going to do that if you're not continuing your education? So I want to conclude then with a few statements. Transitioning into positions of leadership requires readiness from a personal as well as an organizational perspective. You can't wait for the organization to invest in you if you're not willing to do some investment for yourself. But for sustained leadership, because remember, we are looking at strategic rather than replacement planning. For sustained leadership, there needs to be the provision of an institutional structure for leadership transition, which is a shift from this being solely a personal decision. I also want to submit that if there must be sustainability of efforts, it will necessitate a commensurate investment in the development and availability of effective organizational systems to support the ease with which nurses are able to transition into those positions. But I also want to submit that if you are considering, and even if you are in a position of leadership, you need to come to the table with, and if you don't, you need to develop core competencies to successfully navigate the challenges associated with transitioning of these leaders. But you also have to recognize that you need to pay attention to the cultural context. Each country has its unique nuances, and your cultural context will affect how you view what are the core competencies that are required for effective functioning. And while leadership was a major competency that we identified, some of the higher level competencies for effective 21st century leaders functioning are required, like being visionary and being financially literate or competent, but they were not identified. So I want to recommend that maybe as a region, and this is something that I would really want to be involved in, we really need to develop a policy brief. And going forward, we'll be doing a piece of research that looks at what has governments been doing to retain nurses. How are we going to ensure that we have effective succession planning? Let's take the evidence. We need to shift focus from experience to a combination of training and experience. But we also need to create and develop strategies for creating supportive environments like acting, mentoring, and investment. And therefore, we as a region have to be clear about what are the core competencies that we need for leaders in this region, bearing in mind its unique nuances. And I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ocho. I have learned so much. I have enjoyed your powerful words as well as your words of wisdom. And I'm sure others have too enjoyed what you had to present this evening. We had about 500 persons on Zoom and about 145 persons on YouTube. So those persons who couldn't log in on Zoom have logged on YouTube as well. So we're going to open up the mics for persons to ask any questions. We'll get a few questions in and then we will close this webinar out. So I'm going to open up the mics because I have everybody on mute. Or you can put your hand up, just raise your hand and I will open your mic so you can ask your question. So if you raise your hand and want to ask a question, and persons are in the chat saying, excellent presentation, Dr. Ocho. Does anybody have a question for Dr. Ocho and they would like to ask at this time? You can raise your hand. or you can open your mic at this time. Miss Shelly Ann Ross, Alexander Ross, you can go ahead. You can unmute your mic. Miss Shelly Ann, you have a question? Okay, hold on. Let me see why. Okay, okay, go ahead.
Right. So I can. Good night, everybody. Excellent presentation, quite timely. It's always a debate, leadership, who should be leader, who should supervise, and it's always the back and forth. But I want to ask you, you made a statement in relation to, I think when you were doing the findings, that some person thought that person should be promoted based on qualifications. That's what you So there's always that debate. I want to know, where do we strike the balance? Those persons who have the years of experience, have the qualifications, and those persons who are coming out with their masters and their bachelors, where do we strike the balance in terms of knowing who is to be promoted?
I mean, I'm sure that most persons like me, we were losing you during your question. But I guess your question is, where do we strike the balance between training and versus experience? And my recommendation is there has to be a combination. If somebody is just certified, no matter how much technical and information they bring to the table, when it comes to the application, there are some things you will never be able to learn in a book. And I will never go for just allowing training and certification to be seen as the trump for positioning a person into authority.
Thank you, Dr. Ocho. Is there any other questions? You can raise your hand at this time. Okay. Nadine, you can unmute your mic. Oh, sorry. I think I muted her again. See if you can do it now. Okay,
can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Oh, brilliant. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Ocho. That was a very riveting and stimulating presentation.
Well,
my background is in nurse education, and I'm just sort of transitioning from the UK back to Trinidad and Tobago. And what I found striking was the paper that was written, published in 2021 by yourselves based on the research. My question is just straight to the point. Is that available in open access, or is it through the subscription?
yes. Yes,
It's not open access paper.
As you know, to publish in reputable journals.
Yes, it is a reputable journal.
Yes.
I know that one. I know that one. Yeah.
Yeah. It's very costly. So what I did, I gave up the access, but I have an author's copy. So
Okay.
I could always make that available if you desire.
I would love to read that. Yes, I would love to have a read of that.
Yes.
So I'll appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes. A pleasure.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Welcome.
Nadine. Thank you, Dr. Ocho. Any other questions? You got a few more questions if anybody else want to ask a question. A few more minutes.
Yes,
Shelley,
somebody has Dorothea has a comment.
Dorothea. Go ahead, Shelly Ann. Let me find Dorothea. Shelly Ann, I saw your hand was up. Hold on 1 minute. Dorothea, you can unmute your mic if you want to make your comment. verbally.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Dr. Ocho. It's so
Hi.
nice to be on your panel this afternoon. I want to thank you so much for creating a motivating climate that is very timely for such a time as this, as we as leaders begin to emerge into position of leadership. And I want to say, as leaders upcoming, you can't just move into a space and don't do any educational background studying and
Yeah.
training. You must continue to advance yourself with knowledge. And as you spoke in your presentation, you have to understand the landscape of the playing field, because there's a lot of ripple effects that we was encounter as leaders. So in moving forward as a young leader aspiring to do greatness in this country, I would like to thank you for your presentation. Thank you for sharing moments and stuff from the educational policies and advancement. I don't care where you run, you can't run from policy, eh?
No.
So I would like to thank you so much. You did an awesome job. You did an awesome job last night in your presentation, and you continue to trend the waves. And I appreciate you for your dire needs as it relates to education in this country and your country in the Caribbean abroad. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much, Dorothea.
Thank you, Sister Francis. Shelly Ann, I'll unmute you. You can go ahead and unmute your mic. Then
You're
that's
hearing me now?
coming
Oh, yeah.
next. Go ahead.
You're hearing me now. Okay. The person who spoke, not the last one, before, they were making reference to the study. I'm not sure if that is the same study where you mentioned St. Vincent and Grenadines was a part of.
Yes.
And I was going to ask the same question in terms of where, well, I wasn't even aware that we actually took part in such a study. So it would be quite interesting for us here in St. Vincent and Grenadines to have access to that study to see what was mentioned. And I just want to make a, no, go ahead,
But
sorry.
as I said, there was no disaggregation of the data because of this small sample size from the other countries. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to make a statement because yes, there are times when persons would say persons are not ambitious enough to do further studies and stuff like that. But sometimes persons need a little push. Some of us need a little encouragement, I should say, to do something so that you have that balance between your experience and the necessary training that you may need to move up. So it's just a thing for us to, to speak with someone who we think we have that potential for upward mobility, to encourage them to do that.
Yes, I agree. That mentoring and support. And this is why nurse leaders sometimes need to identify persons. There are lots of nurses who never saw their potential, but because somebody saw the potential in them. I was just a staff nurse on the ward doing my work, enjoying my work. And people said to me, why don't you go into medicine? You will get very far. And within 4 years, within 3 years rather, after passing the exam, I was sent to staff development to teach the persons who were senior to me because people saw potential. And we cannot be so hypersensitive that we feel if we identify a talent, it's going to destroy other people. Yeah. I see 3 hands.
Okay. Muting the next one now. Dasare. Hope I'm pronouncing that last name
Hi,
right.
Dr. Ocho. I must commend you. I must commend you for a very impactful presentation. I know last night I was very much upset that I couldn't get in.
Wow, I'm
However,
so sorry.
I logged in like 1 hour before in order to get in. But I must say it is not a question, but I am in support, and I know what you said. It's so true that many a times you find that instead of succession planning, we do replacement planning.
Yeah.
And we do not examine the individual in its entirety in order to fill that position. And I also want to say at this time that many persons will go theoretically, but in terms of achievement, you'll find that, okay, I'm going to move from an RN to my bachelor's, to my master's, and even my doctorals. But then theory goes hand in hand with practical. And that is where competency comes into play. And thirdly, you just made a very relevant point when you said someone can see the potential in you that you are not seeing. And that is where that is something that actually happened to me a couple of years ago, back in 2019, that I wasn't seeing the potential that I had, but senior persons saw the potential in me that I can do it. And so you just have to exercise that kind of competency. And as we will normally say, you reach for the star. And when you explore that kind of skill that you have, then you really know what you're made of. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nalini. That's our CNO from Guyana.
Hello. Thank you and welcome. Okay, next person, Sister Fernanda. You can unmute your mic.
Good afternoon.
Good
The lady
evening.
that was on kind of touched on what I wanted to thank Dr. Ocho for speaking about, in terms where persons are moving away from succession planning to replacement planning. And a lot of times we tend to miss persons, or there's lack of training in preparation for succession planning. So as nurse leaders, we need to ensure that we are doing due diligence to our staff in preparing them to become future leaders. Excellent presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Miss Taylor, you can unmute your mic.
Oh, you can hear me?
Yes, Miss Taylor.
Great presentation, Dr. Ocho.
Thank you.
You talked about the past nurses of the past, and you talked about the present nurses now. And you said that the nurses in the past, most of them were not qualified, and most of the nurses today are qualified. Now, the nurses today are qualified and they have some experience, but what about the attitude? How do they go about transitioning into a position with bad attitude? Because I've noticed a lot. Does that matter, or just qualification and the experience?
Right. What I said is that they were not certified from a university perspective, but they were all qualified as RNs. But none of them had a degree. What we are having now is more persons who are degreed. But that doesn't mean that they are more competent. Now, if you want my presentation last night, my presentation focused on greater levels of training will result in greater levels of competence. But what we are seeing in the Caribbean is that persons, especially if you have a duality of training, persons who are doing the bachelor's look down on persons who are doing the diploma or the associate degree. And as a result, those who do the bachelor's assume that they are to be desk nurses, while the associate degree and diploma persons are supposed to be the dirty nurses. And that in and of itself provides some level of hierarchy and conflict and tensions, and therefore exacerbate the attitudes that are inconsistent. And I want to say that whether you have a degree, whether it's at the bachelor's, the master's, or the doctoral level, if even you are an educator, If your students are not made to feel cared for, how do you expect them to go to the clinical area and care? Because they don't feel cared for from the period of their training. And they're coming from all kinds of social environments. As an administrator, if you don't demonstrate care and concern for your staff, how will they feel when it comes to taking care of the patients? So this has to take a multi-pronged approach, but it also will have to take accountability. Somebody has to hold persons accountable because the essence of nursing is still caring.
Thank you for your question. And this will be the last question for this evening. And this will come from, or a comment from Miss Bernadette. You can unmute your mic now.
Hi, good evening. Am I audible?
Yes, you are, Bernadette.
Okay. Hi, Dr. Ocho. Good night. Good night, everyone.
How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Good.
And again, well, very powerful and excellent presentation as usual. Very timely indeed. Unfortunately, I got lost. My audio got lost during the question and answer segment. So I am not sure whether that the question that I am going to pose here have already been asked. So apologies for that if it has
That's all
been
right.
asked.
That's all right. Ask it.
Yeah, I just regained my audio. So I have two questions, Dr. Ocho. The first one, how can new nursing leaders balance the demands of administrative tasks with the need to stay connected to their frontline staff? And my other question is, what advice would you give to nurses who are unaware if they want to pursue a leadership or management role in their career?
Okay. First, let me answer your first question first. Being a leader doesn't mean that you are in a different sphere than those whom you lead. So it's important that when you assume your role, that you understand and you make it clear that this is a role of accountability, but it doesn't take away your capacity to maintain relationships. Now, managing the relationships is the critical issue. And therefore, if people want to maintain that friendship, they need to recognize that you cannot compromise your core occupational responsibility for social networking. So you need to ensure that people are clear that this is your role on where I am your leader, but outside of work, we maintain friendships. But if you want to be my friend, you need to respect my rule. That's one key thing. Two, you also recognize that even if persons, and some persons, may not accept you as a leader, since you didn't put yourself there, you have to recognize that since you accepted a responsibility, you must be tasked to execute it. Your second question has to do with if you're not sure if you want to be a leader or manager, the reality is you cannot divorce being both a leader a manager because at the end of the day, your position requires the maintenance of structures, systems, and processes. But you also need to ensure that you have to motivate persons to get there. So you cannot be a leader without a manager, and you cannot be a manager without being a leader. The both must come together.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Ocho. Thank you
You're,
so much for
you're
that
welcome.
enlightenment. Yes, very well said. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sister Kamabach, I see your hand is still up, and then I'll let Dr. Cash wrap it up. You can unmute your mic, Sister Kamabach.
Good night, Professor. Excellent presentation as usual.
Oh, you're cracking up very
Inspiring.
badly, Antoinette.
Yeah, we can't hear you, Sister Kamabach.
Professor, also, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you now, Antoinette.
Yeah, I was saying, okay, I said excellent presentation as usual, always educational and very inspiring. And I can certainly attest to everything you have said today, everything, especially in the scenarios that you use. And I just want to say succession planning is still very, very lacking. And it's a challenge, a major challenge in the workplace. And I feel like a lack of effective coaching and mentoring for preparations for upward mobility is very down. And I feel like without the true hallmark of a leader is preparing their successors, and without that, creating competent leaders to take over, I feel like that is you're not really it's a failure in your leadership role. So I just want to encourage persons out there who are in senior positions to make sure you prepare the your subordinates for the real takeover, because without it you'll leave the area or the space or the organization in a very bad place. So we need to really, it doesn't mean that we're going to take your job from you. That's not going to happen until the time comes. So during this period, the waiting period, I feel like managers need to put more emphasis on creating competent successors. And that's all I want to say. And I thank you, Dr. Ocho. You are simply the best. And I love you.
Okay, Antoinette.
Okay, so we'll wrap up with Dr. Cash, Paula Cash. You can unmute your mic. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Brown, and good night to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Ocho.
Esteemed colleague, Dr. Cash.
And to all of those present on the platform, Dr. Ocho, awesome, awesome presentation as always. And I just wanted to end the evening by saying to you publicly that you are such a treasured resource to our region. And we really do value the contribution that you make to the advancement of health and social and economic development within our region. And also, I just wanted to commend the Omega chapter for this focus on leadership, because, the development of strong and effective leaders is so important, not only to the development of our health systems, but also to the social and economic development within our region. Thank you so much. And it is such a wonderful pleasure, Dr. Ocho, to just sit a second evening under your tutelage. It's such a blessing, and we are so honored by your presence and your contribution.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
I'm hoping to come to CNO.
Wonderful, wonderful. We look forward to having you there. It would be such a pleasure to have you. And I noted in your presentation, you indicated that the Bahamas was one of those countries who did not get the ethical approval for the conduct of the study. And I was just wondering if there is an opportunity for us to have that study replicated in the Bahamas, because we would have just recently promoted quite a number of young nurses, and it would be really interesting to
Yeah.
get their perspectives
Oh, it
as
would be
they
nice.
transition.
I have no problems. As long as we get ethical approval, we can do that.
Oh,
But I'll be looking at, another study that really is going to be focused now on what are the government's initiatives that focus on retention of nursing personnel. Um, and this is a key um, activity coming out of our terms of reference for our collaborating center here. So
yes,
I'll
and
be
we look
coming back to
forward.
Bahamas again.
Yes, we look forward to collaborating in that regard. We really
Yes,
do.
definitely.
Thank you.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for having me, Alia. It really was a delight, and I really I'm pleased with the response this evening, as was yesterday.
I must say the same. Thank you all for joining us this evening. As it relates to your CNE hours, make sure we have your name, full name, and email address. And if, for those persons who did not use the registration link, we encourage you to use the registration link. But if you did not use it, ensure that your name and email address is in the chat if you have not done so already, as it relates to that. But thank you, Dr. Ocho. It is always a pleasure speaking with you, having you present. You are always willing to do so. And I think we need to make this a series. Me and you will discuss it and see where we can take this nursing leadership and management series and come back with something, different or around there, something you may have missed or didn't elaborate enough on that we can make that into another webinar for our chapter. So we'll have that discussion because I'm sure you have a lot of ideas where we can move forward as it relates to nursing leadership and management. So, with that said, thank you all for joining us. And we are the Omega Kappa chapter of Sigma Theta Tau International. And it was a pleasure having you this evening. My name is Miss Alia Brown, and I am the president of the Omega Kappa chapter, and I'm from the Bahamas. So I know a lot of my Bahamian nurses colleagues were on this evening. So thank you once again and enjoy the rest of your evening.